The ghost of my husband, Frank, lingered not in the hollow spaces of our home, but in the sharp, clean scent of turpentine and the rich, earthy perfume of linseed oil that had soaked into the very bones of his studio. For 50 years, that small, sun-drenched room at the back of the house had been his sanctuary, his confessional, his whole world outside of me. The floorboards were a chaotic map of his mind, a testament to decades of passionate drips, accidental splatters, and the deliberate wiping of brushes. Canvases, dozens and dozens of them, were stacked against every available wall, leaning on one another like old friends sharing a long-held secret. They were his life's work, his joy, his quiet rebellion against a world that had always tried to shoehorn him into a more sensible life, a life as a salesman, a manager, and anything but an artist. I loved them with a fierce and protective tenderness because I loved him. Each bold stroke was a piece of his soul made visible, a memory captured in the shimmering permanence of oil and pigment. There was the churning, violent sea from our fraught trip to Cape Ann, Massachusetts, back in '78, the waves a tempest of angry blues and greens that mirrored the argument we'd had and the passionate reconciliation that followed. There was the hazy, almost divine golden light of Sonoma County, painted on our 20th anniversary, so warm and gentle you could almost feel the California sun on your skin. And there was the simple, perfect portrait of our sleeping cat, Marmalade, his orange fur rendered so precisely that you half expected to see his whiskers twitch or hear the faint rumble of his purr. He never sold a single one. He never even tried. "They're not for them, Clara," he would say, his large, gentle hands, perpetually stained with cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue, wiping themselves on his already ruined trousers. "They're for us. They're our story." Since he'd passed 6 months ago, the silence in the house had become a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all joy. But his studio was the one place where the silence felt different, less like a painful absence and more like a peaceful, reverent quiet. I would spend hours in his worn leather armchair, the one with the arms cracked like old riverbeds and the permanent, perfect indentation of his body. I would sit and simply breathe him in, letting the memories wash over me. I'd trace the landscapes with my eyes, remembering the specific day he painted each one, the music he was listening to, the way he'd hum off-key when a particular section was going well. My son, Mark, never understood. He couldn't. To him, the studio was just a cluttered room, a waste of valuable square footage in a house he increasingly viewed as a line item on a balance sheet. He was a man who measured the worth of a life in profit margins and stock portfolios, a cold, hard language as foreign to his father's spirit as ancient Sanskrit. Mark saw the world in black and white, in assets and liabilities. Frank's paintings, to him, were a definitive, embarrassing liability. I knew he was coming over today, and a familiar, acidic knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. He'd been using phrases like making some changes and maximizing the property's potential for weeks. I knew what that meant. It meant erasing his father, sanding away the last traces of his vibrant, colorful life until nothing but a sterile, profitable shell remained. Mark arrived precisely at noon, his gleaming black sedan gliding silently into the driveway like a shark into a quiet lagoon. He didn't bother to knock. He used the key I'd given him for emergencies, and the sound of it turning in the lock felt like a small, sharp violation. He strode into the living room, already deep in a conversation on his phone, one hand held up in a gesture that meant, "Give me a minute." He was dressed in a crisp, dark suit and shoes so polished they reflected the worn pattern of our Persian rug. He looked like a predator who had wandered into a petting zoo, all sharp angles and predatory focus, in a home built on soft edges and comfortable love. "No, tell them to liquidate the position by end of day," he said into his phone, his voice a sharp, impatient staccato. I don't care about the short-term dip. The fundamentals are shot. It's dead weight. He finally ended the call, slipping the phone into his pocket, and turned to me. His smile was a carefully constructed thing that didn't come close to reaching his cold, assessing eyes. Clara, he said, using my first name as he always did now, as if Mom was too sentimental a word for his vocabulary. He leaned in and kissed the air an inch from my cheek. Good to see you. Now, about the plan. I braced myself, my hand unconsciously tightening on the arm of my chair. What plan, Mark? I asked, my voice softer than I intended, already feeling the erosion of my will in his presence. He gestured expansively, his arms sweeping across the room as if to dismiss everything in it. This place. It needs a serious update. It's a prime piece of real estate, Clara. You're sitting on a gold mine, but it's hopelessly dated. I'm thinking we knock out this wall, create an open concept living space, new floors, gut the kitchen, maybe some recessed lighting. It'll boost the value tremendously. A complete overhaul. He walked past me without waiting for a response, his expensive shoes making decisive, alien sounds on the old hardwood floors. He was heading directly for the back of the house. I knew where he was going. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings. He pushed open the door to Frank's studio and stood there, a look of profound, undisguised distaste contorting his features. And this, he said, waving a dismissive hand at the dozens of canvases, at the very soul of his father. This has to be the first thing to go. It's a fire hazard, for one. It smells. And honestly, it's just clutter. Clutter. The word hung in the air between us, acrid and insulting, a stunning act of desecration. 50 years of a man's heart, his passion, his legacy, reduced to a housekeeping term. Mark, your father, I started, my voice trembling, but he cut me off with a sharp, impatient chop of his hand. Dad was a great guy, Clara, but let's be realistic. He had a hobby, a messy one. It's time to be practical and forward-thinking. I'm having a dumpster delivered tomorrow morning. We'll clear this out. I'll get a contractor in here by Monday, and we can turn this into a proper home gym or a media room, something useful. He wasn't asking. He was informing me of a decision already made. He saw my face then, the raw shock and the deep well of pain I couldn't hide, and his expression softened into one of condescending pity, which was infinitely worse. It's for the best, Clara. We have to move on from the past. I argued, I pleaded, I summoned every ounce of strength I had left. I pointed to a small, vibrant painting of a single bluebird on a branch. Mark, look at this one. Your father painted this the week you were born. He said you were his little bird who had flown into our lives. I gestured to another, a dark and moody landscape. He painted this one the night his own mother died. He poured all his grief into that canvas so he could be strong for me. I tried to make him see that they weren't just objects. They were the scaffolding of our life, the illustrated autobiography of my 50-year marriage, a history book of our family, of my Mark listened with a patient, infuriating smile, the kind one gives a confused, sentimental child who doesn't understand the adult world. I hear you, Clara. I really do, he said, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. But feelings don't pay the property taxes. Feelings don't increase our equity. We need to be pragmatic. The next morning, a massive rusted metal dumpster was deposited at the end of our driveway with a deafening, final-sounding crash that rattled the windows. It sat there like a great, hungry vulture, waiting to be fed the remnants of my life. I couldn't watch. I locked myself in my bedroom, pressing a pillow over my ears, but I couldn't block out the sounds. I heard Mark's sharp, commanding voice directing the two men he'd hired. I heard their loud, careless footsteps and their gruff, disinterested voices. I heard the awful scraping sound of canvas frames being dragged against the door jambs, followed by the sickening, hollow thud as each painting was tossed unceremoniously into the metal bin. Thud. Frank's grief for his mother. Thud. Frank's joy at the birth of his son. Thud. 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 Each sound was a physical blow, a fresh wound. The soul of our house was being ripped out, piece by piece, and thrown away like trash. When it was finally, dreadfully quiet, I ventured out. The studio was horrifically, unnaturally empty. It was sterile. The walls were bare, showing lighter, cleaner rectangles where the paintings had protected the wallpaper from 50 years of sun. The air, for the first time in my memory, didn't smell of paint and creativity. It smelled only of dust and a profound, echoing emptiness. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. Mark came in, wiping dust from his hands onto his expensive trousers. "See? So much better," he said, a triumphant, self-satisfied grin on his face. A clean slate, a world of potential. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? Tears were streaming down my face, hot and silent. I couldn't form a single word. "Oh, Clara, don't be so dramatic," he sighed, his brief flicker of patience completely extinguished. "It was just a bunch of worthless junk. Dad knew it, and deep down, so do you. Let's not be precious about it. Now, let's go get some lunch. My treat." He turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the desecrated room where my husband's legacy had just been murdered. The sheer, unthinking cruelty of it was breathtaking. He hadn't just cleaned out a room. He had thrown my heart, my history, and my husband's spirit in the trash. That night, long after Mark had gone back to his own sleek, minimalist house, a place with no memories on the walls, I put on my old gardening coat and a pair of thick gloves. The moon was just a cruel sliver in the inky, starless sky, and the street was blanketed in a heavy silence. Every fiber of my being screamed in protest. I was 72 years old. My bones ached. I should be in bed, reading a book, not preparing to go dumpster diving like a desperate homeless vagrant. But the thought of Frank's paintings, of his very essence, rotting under a pile of coffee grounds and discarded mail, was a pain sharper than any physical ailment. I couldn't let them go. I couldn't let Mark's cynical world be the final arbiter of my husband's worth. With a flashlight held tight between my teeth, my breath pluming in the cold night air, I struggled with the heavy, rusted latch on the side door of the dumpster. It finally gave way with a groan, and I pulled the heavy door open. The metallic stench of garbage, stale beer, and damp cardboard hit me like a physical force. They had thrown a few black bags of trash on top. A final, thoughtless insult. My hands trembled with a mixture of grief and fury, but I pushed the bags aside. And there they were, stacked haphazardly like firewood. Some frames were cracked, and I could see a canvas near the bottom with a long, ugly tear slashed across its corner. A wave of nausea and sorrow washed over me. I began to lift them out, one by one, my old muscles screaming with the unaccustomed effort. They were heavier than I remembered, weighted down with memory and grief and the full, terrible gravity of this moment. I carried them, two at a time, across the dew-soaked lawn and into the garage, laying them carefully on old blankets I'd spread on the floor. It took me over an hour. Finally, they were all safe. I knelt on the cold concrete floor, my knees protesting, and began to gently wipe the grime off a portrait of me from when I was a young woman, my hair long and my eyes full of a future I couldn't have imagined. As my fingers brushed against the signature in the bottom right corner, I saw it wasn't Frank Thompson. It was Caleb Marsh. And then the memory came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave, a quiet conversation from years and years ago, a moment I had almost forgotten, filed away as one of Frank's romantic eccentricities. He had been unusually serious that evening. "Clara," he had said, taking both of my hands in his paint-stained ones, "the world isn't ready for me, and I'm not ready for it. But things change. People change. If the time ever comes, if they ever break your heart and you need a lifeline, there's a man, an art critic named Alistair Sinclair. You tell him you have the lost collection of Caleb Marsh." It had sounded like a game at the time, a sweet, secret fantasy we shared. Caleb Marsh, the mysterious, reclusive post-war painter whose small body of known work had recently, posthumously, sent the art world into a frenzy. He had disappeared in the late 1960s, and his lost works were the stuff of legend, the holy grail for art historians, rumored to be worth a staggering fortune. I had never connected it to my Frank, my quiet, unassuming husband who painted for love, not for glory. My son called them junk. My husband had called them a lifeline. Standing there in the cold, silent garage, surrounded by the beautiful, discarded pieces of our life, I finally understood. Frank had left me a secret key to a world Mark couldn't even comprehend. The next morning, my hands were still shaking, but this time it was not with grief or frailty, but with a terrifying, electric sense of purpose. I made a pot of coffee, my movements deliberate and slow, and sat at the kitchen table. The silence of the house no longer felt empty, but charged, like the air before a lightning strike. I found my old address book, its pages softened and worn with decades of use. The ink of old friends' names faded with time. Under S, I found the entry, written in Frank's elegant, familiar script, Alistair Sinclair, followed by a San Francisco phone number and the cryptic note, "The only one who will understand." I stared at the number for a full 10 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt it in my throat. This was the precipice. What if he thought I was a delusional old woman? What if this was all a fantasy Frank had spun for himself? What if his secretary just laughed and hung up on me? The risk of fresh humiliation, of having this last desperate hope extinguished, was immense. But then, the image of Mark's smug, triumphant face swam before my eyes. The echo of his words, "worthless junk," was stronger than any fear I had. I took a deep, shuddering breath and dialed the number. Fear I had. A crisp, professional, and slightly bored voice answered on the second ring. Alistair Sinclair's office. May I please speak with him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, betraying the storm of emotion inside me. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinclair is in a meeting, and his schedule is full for the rest of the week. May I take a message?" The voice replied, the tone a polite but firm wall. "Please," I said, my resolve hardening with each word. "Please tell him Eleanor Thompson called. Tell him I have found the lost collection of Caleb Marsh." There was a palpable pause on the other end of the line, a silence thick with well-practiced skepticism. "Ma'am," the receptionist began, her voice dripping with condescension, "we get calls of this nature quite often. If you'd like to submit a portfolio by mail—" "I understand," I interrupted, my voice gaining a strength that surprised me. "But my late husband, Frank Thompson, told me to call Mr. Sinclair specifically. He knew him. Please, just give him the name. Caleb Marsh." I could hear the faint sound of the receptionist covering the phone, a muffled, impatient-sounding exchange, and then a different voice came on the line, a man's voice, sharp, cultured, and alert. "This is Alistair Sinclair. To whom am I speaking?" "Mr. Sinclair, My name is Clara Thompson. My husband, Frank Thompson, passed away recently. He was a painter. I'm very sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thompson, he said, his tone polite but clearly guarded. But I'm afraid I'm not familiar with an artist by that name. I know, I said, my voice perfectly steady now, carried by a certainty that came from beyond myself. You would have known him as Caleb Marsh. A profound silence met my words. It stretched for so long, I thought he had hung up. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic through his receiver. Then I heard a sharp, whistling intake of breath. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice now completely stripped of its professional detachment, replaced by a raw, vibrating excitement that was almost shocking in its intensity. Where are you? I can be on a plane tomorrow. Alistair Sinclair was not what I had expected. I had pictured a stuffy, older academic in a rumpled tweed jacket. The man who arrived in a taxi the next afternoon was in his late 50s, with an artist's fiery intensity in his eyes, a shock of silver hair, and faint smudges of what looked like blue paint on the cuffs of his expensive-looking linen shirt. He carried a slim, black leather briefcase and shook my hand with a two-handed grip, a gesture of such profound reverence that it was deeply unsettling after Mark's casual, dismissive disrespect. He politely refused my offer of tea. He wanted to see the paintings immediately. I led him to the garage. I had spent the morning cleaning and organizing it as best I could, creating aisles between the leaning canvases. The paintings were illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead fluorescent bulbs, and I worried they looked tawdry and sad. Alistair stopped dead in the doorway. He didn't speak. He just stared, his mouth slightly agape, his briefcase forgotten in his hand. He walked slowly into the center of the garage, turning in a slow, deliberate circle as if he were standing in the heart of a sacred, long-lost cathedral. My God, he whispered, the words barely audible, more a prayer than an exclamation. It's real. He set down his case and knelt before the portrait of Marmalade the cat, pulling a small, powerful magnifying glass from an inner pocket. He examined the brushwork, the texture of the paint, the way Frank had layered the glazes to create the illusion of soft fur. He moved to the stormy sea from Cape Ann, and then to the golden landscape of Sonoma County, and then to the next, and the next. For over an hour, he was completely lost to the world, a man communing with ghosts. He murmured to himself about Frank's impasto techniques, his revolutionary color theory, and the unmistakable emotional weight in every composition. He seemed to be seeing not just paintings, but the story of a life. Finally, he straightened up, his knees cracking softly, and turned to me. His eyes, when they met mine, were shining with unshed tears. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice thick with a profound, overwhelming emotion. For 30 years, the art world has wondered what happened to Caleb Marsh. We thought he had died, or simply stopped painting in some fit of despair. We thought his genius was lost to us forever. He gestured to the rows and rows of canvases that filled my garage. It wasn't lost. It was here. He was living and loving and creating his masterwork in absolute secret. This isn't just a collection, it's a treasure. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most significant artistic discoveries of the 21st century. He looked from the radiant paintings to my tired face, and a dawning, sickening horror crept into his expression. You said you found them? My voice was flat and hollow as I told him the whole story. I told him about Mark, about the plans for a home gym, about the word clutter, about the rusted metal dumpster. His face, which had been alight with a pure, scholarly joy, hardened into a mask of cold, intellectual fury. He threw these away, he said, disbelief warring with a terrible, rising anger. He threw away a fortune that could be valued in the hundreds of millions. But that's just money. It's meaningless. He threw away this. He gestured to the paintings again, his hand shaking slightly. "This is a man's soul, Mrs. Thompson. A beautiful, brilliant soul, and your son put it in the trash." The world, as I had known it, erupted. Alistair Sinclair was a force of nature, a man possessed by a mission. He handled everything with a ferocious, protective energy, shielding me from the onslaught he knew was coming. It started with an exclusive, multi-page feature in the New York Times art section, its headline blazing across the page, "The Ghost of Caleb Marsh, Lost Collection of a Generation, Worth Hundreds of Millions, Found in Suburban Garage." The article was poetic and respectful, featuring a beautiful photograph of me sitting in Frank's restored studio, which Alistair had insisted we put back exactly as it was, surrounded by the vibrant, glowing paintings. From there, the story exploded like a supernova. Art blogs, cable news channels, international papers from Rome to Madrid. My quiet suburban street, where the most exciting event was usually the arrival of the ice cream truck, was suddenly lined with gleaming news vans, their satellite dishes pointing at my roof like metallic sunflowers. The phone rang so incessantly, with calls from strangers, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in decades, and reporters, that I finally had to unplug it from the wall. Curators from the MoMA and the Getty sent formal, reverent letters. Auction houses sent emissaries who spoke in hushed, breathless tones about record-breaking sales. A prestigious San Francisco gallery, the Atherton Project, offered to host a world premiere debut exhibition, Caleb Marsh, The Secret Years. And then, late one evening, the call I had been waiting for finally came through on my cell phone. "Clara?" It was Mark. His voice was unrecognizable, a high-pitched, strangled sound, thin and reedy with panic. "Clara, what the hell is going on? I'm seeing you on TV. They're saying Dad's paintings. They're saying this name, Caleb Marsh." "Yes, Mark," I said, my voice perfectly calm, a small island of stillness in his hurricane of panic. "It turns out your father's junk is quite valuable." There was a choked, gasping sound on the other end of the line. "Millions? They're saying hundreds of millions? Clara, this is our inheritance. We're rich. My God, we need to get a lawyer. We need to secure the assets. We need to stop these gallery people from taking control." The ecstatic, greedy speed with which he said the word "we" was like a shard of glass in my ear. "There is no we, Mark," I said, my voice as cold and hard and clean as a block of ice. "You threw your inheritance in a dumpster. You abdicated your role in this family and in his legacy. You made your choice quite clear. These were my husband's paintings. Now they are mine." "But I'm your son. It's family," he pleaded, his voice cracking now with a desperate, whining entitlement. "You can't cut me out of this. I didn't know." "Family," I repeated softly, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "You should have thought of that when you were tossing your father's heart into a garbage bin to make room for a treadmill. You should have remembered family when you called his life's work clutter. The Atherton Project opening is in 2 weeks, Mark. Don't bother coming." I ended the call, and the silence that followed was the cleanest, most peaceful sound I had heard in 6 months. The opening at the Atherton Project was an otherworldly affair. The gallery was a cathedral of modern art, all soaring white walls, polished concrete floors, and dramatic pinpoint lighting that made Frank's paintings seem to glow with an inner, living light. They had never looked so powerful, so magnificent, so important. A hushed, reverent crowd of San Francisco's cultural and financial elite drifted from canvas to canvas, speaking in whispers, their faces illuminated by the genius on the walls. I stood near the portrait of Marmalade the cat, wearing a simple, elegant black dress that Alistair had insisted on buying for me. I felt, strangely, preternaturally calm, as if I were merely a quiet observer in someone else's beautiful, impossible dream. Then I saw him, a disturbance in the calm. Mark was pushing his way aggressively through the sophisticated crowd, his face pale and slick with sweat, his expensive suit looking rumpled and desperate. He ignored the offended glares and the discreet security guards who tried to intercept him, his eyes wild and locked on me with a terrifying single-mindedness. He finally broke through the circle of people around me and stopped, his chest heaving as if he'd run a marathon. "Clara!" he hissed, his voice a low, desperate plea that was somehow more shocking than a shout in the gallery's hushed atmosphere. "You have to stop this. You can't. These belong to the family, to me. This is my father's legacy. You can't do this." A small, perfect circle of silence formed around us as every head in the vicinity turned to stare. The public confrontation he had created was here, and I was ready for it. "These belong to Caleb Marsh," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying through the suddenly silent gallery with bell-like clarity. "A man you never knew, a brilliant, sensitive man whose soul you called junk and threw into a dumpster." "I didn't know," he cried, his voice breaking, raw with self-pity. "How was I supposed to know they were worth money?" I looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time I felt not pain, not grief, not even anger, but a vast, empty, and profound pity for the smallness of his soul. "That's the entire point, Mark. You weren't supposed to know their price. You were supposed to know their value. You were supposed to love your father enough to see the beauty in what he made. You were supposed to respect your mother enough to listen." I turned away from him then, a simple, final gesture. I turned my back on my son and faced the crowd, which had become a silent jury. I looked at Frank's work, his vibrant, beautiful, immortal soul, hanging on the walls for the whole world to finally see and to love. Two security guards gently but firmly took a sputtering, defeated Mark by the arms and escorted him out of the gallery and out of my life. I reached out and lightly, lovingly, touched the ornate frame of Frank's painting of the Sonoma Hills. He had told me he was leaving me a lifeline. I had thought it was about the money, but as I stood there, bathed in the warm, golden light of his art, I knew the truth. The lifeline wasn't the fortune. It was the art itself. It was the proof that love and beauty were real, and that they would always, in the end, be worth more than anything else. And his legacy, like my own spirit, was finally, blessedly safe.